Syria is kind of at a crossroads, and it's in a strategic position within the Middle East. If you look at to the north is Turkey. Also, Russia has two bases in there in the Lataki area, which is one, and then the Tartus area. They have a naval base and an air base, and so you have this confluence of things, and of course, with the Assad Alawite government, the Alawites are Shiite. They were backed by Iran. So Iran is heavily in there. In fact, it's believed that Iran may have been instigators of some of the violence that led to this, instigators of the insurgency that led to this violence that we've just seen. And then the other part of it is you've got ISIS. That's why the U.S. is in Syria. And we have troops and we have bases in Syria, and we're there on a counter ISIS program. And we're working side by side with a Kurdish group, which Turkey is kind of backing the HTS, the current the focus or the nucleus of the current government. So they're in there backing them. They want to go against the Kurds. I got to tell you, there's just a lot of stuff going on there, and it's tough to keep the chess pieces straight because this thing here moves the dice a little bit. As I mentioned, the Iranians are seen to be backing this insurgency that led to this violence. The Iranians are allied very closely with the Russians. The Russians are working a deal with the Syrian government, the HTS led government, to try and keep their bases in Syria. So they're trying to appease the current government that just went in and did this massive, I'm just going to call it what it is, massacre against the Alawites in those coastal regions. And yet, if you look at that, Russia and Iran are allies, but they might actually be on opposite sides of what's happening in Syria. It's a fascinating situation. Oh, and by the way, did I mention that Israel is in southern Syria and occupies terrain down there, and they're at odds with the current government as well?
So this is 3 months after we saw the Assad regime fall. Is there any chance that there could be another regime change in the future?
There's nothing in place that looks like it could pose a threat to the current regime. I'm sure the Alawites would love to see some way that they could reassert themselves or maybe turn that coastal area into a breakaway province or something along those lines. And a number of those Alawite families were actually hanging, basically living close to the Russian bases. And it's presumed that they felt that there was some degree of security by being close to the Russian bases because the Russians were, the number one backers of Assad and his Alawite-led government. But there's nothing that really poses that kind of threat. And of course, the other side too is that Turkey backs this new Syrian government, and Turkey is a major military presence, if you will, in the region. And so, with their backing, it's just really not foreseeable that any group that's currently there could pose a threat. Although one of the things that does certainly concern the new Syrian government and concerns Turkey, and obviously concerns ironically the Iranians, who are very much opposed to what Turkey and the HTS led Syrian government are doing, is the Israeli presence, which seems to be growing incrementally. And that was because they held the Golan Heights. And then when everything just kind of fell apart in Syria, they said we could be basically under threat here. There's nothing that's going to protect the border. So they actually moved in and took the higher ground, if you will. There's a mountain that's just north of the Golan Heights. And so they took the highest ground, if you will, to give them a buffer with whatever goes on. And certainly right now, if you look at the confusion on the ground in Syria, I don't see the Israelis being in any mood to pull back their forces.
How would the West like this situation to play out? What does the U.S. want to see happen in Syria?
That is a good question. I don't know. It is not at all clear. Interesting. Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, is having a little bit of a, I don't know, I told you so sort of thing. She, during her hearings and prior to the hearings, she had visited Syria under Assad. She had said some things that were seen as somewhat flattering to the Assad government. But during her hearing, she said, "Look, Assad is bad. I don't support any dictators." But on the other hand, this HTS group is basically, which is true, they're led by the former, head of Al Qaeda, which was called the Al Nusra Front. And there, when ISIS went one direction, Al Qaeda kind of went another direction. ISIS went direction in the other side of Syria, away from the coast, I should say, and near Iraq, and then went into Iraq. That was ISIS doing that. But the Al Nusra Front was more affiliated with Al Qaeda. Well, the head of HTS, Jelani, was the head of Al Qaeda for Syria. And over time, he basically became part of this, became the head of this kind of this, not just the HTS originally, but what has grown into this larger group that became HTS that was eventually big enough to go down there and overthrow the Assad government. Well, that's Jelani. All right. And so he's there and he's got that position. He's in a pretty stable position in that regard. But for the US, where do we go? We don't want, I mean, on the one hand, you have the Alawites aligned with the Syrians, the former Assad regime that was tied in with the Russians, that were, tied in with Hezbollah, that were threatening, Israel and launching missiles into Israel and fighting the Israeli Defense Forces in southern Lebanon and engaged in all sorts of stuff. Well, we don't want them. On the other hand, we definitely don't want Al Qaeda, and we don't want anything associated with Al Qaeda. So we're, I don't say we're ambivalent, but it's not really clear where we go on this. And certainly, if you listen to the director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, I'm sure she's going to say, "Look, we want to, stand back on whatever we do with the new Syrian government because they are tied in. They were originally came from Al Qaeda. She's on the official record having said that. So I imagine there'll be some pressure, at least from her,
Yeah.
to say, hey, look, let's stand back. The issue, though, is Turkey. What do we want our relationship with Turkey to look like? And in the past, during the first Trump administration, you may recall that President Trump made the decision to pull our forces out of Syria after having a discussion with Erdogan in Turkey. And so obviously there's a relationship there in the past that caused us to pull our forces out. Everything else that I just discussed previously would be every reason in the world why we have to maintain our forces there. But the question is, will Erdogan try to compel the U.S. to pull forces out or change our policy and stuff? And then it will be rather interesting because, I mean, hypothetically, if we were to say we're going to create a relationship with the HTS government, well, that would be kind of diametrically opposed to what Tulsi Gabbard said during her Senate confirmation hearing.